Okay, I believe. Box. I prepared this lovely example that does almost nothing, it's a good starting ground for what we're going to be talking about today. So we have our entry point, our index.js, where it's all been set up with Redux. So we have our store, we have a very simple reducer, we have a collection of actions here, very, very simple. And yeah, the entry point, all it does is that it scaffolds up or bootstraps up our Redux thing with the provider and a form renders. So this is our component, the form. And inside the form, there's a bunch of stuff that's going on right now. There is a thing for the input field, there's a thing for the message field, and also a save button. And the rest of the things are just UI based. So the thing that constructs the card UI and stuff like that. All of this, by the way, comes from HSDS React. This is what it looks like out of the box, which is great because I was able to construct this really fast. Um, if I take a look at the component itself, form, it's a stateless functional component. It doesn't do anything. It gets all the state and the actions and all the things that it needs from Redux via connect. And you bind the two using map state to props, which is where you can pluck props using, in our case, selectors. These are just functions that kind of grab bits of state from the Redux state and maps it and passes it down to map state to props. That way, this pattern is really great. It's a lot more reliable than doing something like this. Title is state title or something like that. That's just because these selectors, they serve as the interface between this and your actual state. So if there's a chance where, excuse me, where the mapping of this changes, like this, well, okay, yeah, of course this doesn't work. Where the mapping of this changes, your application shouldn't break because you're using something to interface between the two. So using selectors is a good idea. There's a library called reselect, which I personally haven't used yet, but I see the value of it, where it actually memoizes things, so you can do computational selections, which is great. So yeah, selectors. Plucking things from Redux state, passing it down to our components, and we have dispatch to props, which are actions that come from this guy here. And again, passes them to our component as props. So before I drill into this guy, I have to mention something that's really important. So in the world of React, people basically refer to everything as components. Everything is a component, which is technically true because everything eventually kind of extends from like React pure component or React component, these classes, or you have your SFCs, your stateless functional components, all of them have the word component in it. But conceptually, not everything is a component because things that are larger than just bits of UI or bits of encapsulated pieces, those, in my opinion, should be thought of as views. So with modern, I guess, React, view as in this, not this. So we want to think of things as views. Views are the things that are larger, whether they create entire pages or chunks of the page that bind or components together, that pluck out various bits of components to compose the UI. That's what views are. And we have views all over the place. So if you're using React Router, for example, you have your route, right? And let's say you have a home page. Let's just call it home page. No, there's a contact page. It's a little bit more interesting. Somewhat a little bit more interesting. And the React route component has a function called render. And in this part, you would pass in the contact page. And that's how, hang on a sec, path equals contact. And that's how you're able to render the contact page with the route. But this page, if you think about it from like a traditional MVC, maybe non-SPA kind of standpoint, this is a page. This is your view. So the contact page component is actually a view. What does it do? Well, it renders things, maybe this form, inside of it. So the responsibility of this component view is to render bits of UI that can then interface with the global state somewhere via via Redux. So with that established, this is basically our hierarchy. And typically within your application, there is sort of like another layer. I'm going to call it UI components. UI components are typically things that you would pluck from a component library or a design system where all the okay, UI components. What are these? These are like all the DOM stuff, presentation, JS math stuff. Typically all those bits are focused on these things. These are the screws to your table. When you get to this level, the component level, this is when you pluck those guys and give it certain properties to behave the way that you would like it to behave within your application. You integrate these UI bits components into your application via something like this. When you need to. Sometimes you can use them out of the box, sometimes you can't. So these are your components. And then those components are then constructed inside of your view. And then your view is then rendered inside of your app. And then now you have an application. Great, you have your table. So with that said, now let's look at this view, this form view. We have just a couple of things. So not paying attention to this page card, and all that kind of stuff. We have two fields, this form field for the title, for the message, and then this actions area for this button. So already, this particular view is doing quite a bit. It needs to manage the state and the actions for 3 different bits of things. And right now it's fine. There's only like 72 lines of code, which isn't too much. But over time, if you can imagine, this can grow very, very fast. And I like using forms as an example because forms are things that visually look the same. You know, you have repeating fields, but then you have to babysit and manage those, every single one of those fields to connect them up to state. And these are things that can, like I mentioned, that can scale really fast and get hairy really, really quickly, especially if you have things like validation or you have more complex interactions like a particular button or field opens up a modal and inside that modal has like more fields, anything like that. This can grow very quickly. So understanding where to make your cuts, where to make your splits in terms of managing logic and presentation and things like that is really important. So the simplest thing that you can do to manage all that kind of stuff, to think about things from an inside-out perspective, is to create lots of little components. The downside of creating lots of little components is you have more files that you need to kind of put in places. But that's about it. I mean, the amount of logic stays the same. You still have 100% logic. Instead of having 100% logic in one file, you have 100% logic in 10 files. And now you have 10% on each of these guys. So contextually, if you were to look at any one of these guys, it's a lot clearer what it does. And it inherently forces you to think about your logic and how it interacts with state in a much more granular way, which the side effect of that is having a lot, the path is a lot clearer in terms of your actions, your reducers, and then also the ability to kind of test things and your components just become a lot simpler that way. So the first one that I will refactor from this page is this button component. So it's plucking from button from HSDS React. So this is our UI component. And it's already doing a couple of things. It needs to render a spinner, whether it's loading, and then it also needs to do something on click, which is saving the form. And what else? Oh yeah, it needs to render a disabled state when it's loading. So if I were to click on Save Changes here, you can see that the button freezes for a second, turns gray, and then does its thing. So the first thing I will do is I'm looking at my view. I know that there's a big chance that I'm going to create little subcomponents from my form view. So the first thing I will do is I will create a folder called form. This provides me with an area to put all this stuff in, where if I look at the project, it's very clear what belongs to what. All these little components that I'm going to be creating belong to the form. And then this form view is basically the encapsulation and the embodiment of that what used to be a single file. And that is then added to our main index here, entry point, which is then rendered. So the typical thing that you would do is within Code Sandbox. I always forget what these icons do. Okay, you create an index.js. This is your index file, or your entry file rather, excuse me. And all this does is that it imports a form and exports it. So internally here, I'm going to create a file. I'm going to call it form.js. This is where the actual view slash component will live. The whole point of the index file is just to uh, provide the entry point for your compiler, Webpack, and so on. Um, the reason why we do this is because when you look at form.js, it's a lot clearer whatever it is you're working on. Just by looking at this tab inside of your IDE or doing a fuzzy search, form.js, it makes it much easier to find, especially if you didn't have this, then basically you'd have hundreds and hundreds of index files, which you would then kind of have to rely on the directory structure to figure out what that is. That was a mistake that I made in the past, and this is a learning from it. It's a good learning lesson. So all we need to do is I'm just going to copy this, put it inside of here, and I need to change the paths a little bit. So the reducer comes from the root, so do actions. So just change those. Great, that's fine. This is good. So now, I think Code Sandbox might explode, but we'll try. I'm gonna delete this. Actually, first I'm just gonna remove this. Okay, it's fine. Delete this. Okay, and now re-import it again. Hopefully this works. Oh wow, great. Because typically when you do moves like that, where a something.js becomes a something directory with an index.js file, Webpack explodes, and then I typically have to restart it over again. Code Sandbox is amazing. I think I am a patron. Patreon. I'm a patron. Yeah, kind of need to be. I think they limit you at 50 sandboxes if you're not a patron. But I've become a patron because I think it's a great project and I would need more sandboxes. Mm-mm-mm. Alrighty, so our form still works. So all the letters you see me typing here are these are controlled inputs, so they're going into Redux state. Cool. Now I can make my split. I need to create a little button guy. So if I do a new file for save, I'm just going to call it save button. Naming things is very important. Name it for what it is. What do I need? I need React from React. What else do I need? I need also to connect it to Redux. So I need connect, React, Redux. Yeah. So I have my const save button, takes in props. I'm going to make a stateless functional component because it's simple. Oh, I also need what else do I need? I need button from HSDS React and also spinner. So I'm going to pluck this, paste it, yank this, put it here. Code Sandbox will complain. I know I'm working on it. Export const map state to props. It does a thing. And then at the very end, export default, connect map state to props, save button. Great. So one very interesting thing, ignoring the errors so far, I made some interesting decisions here. What we found in building JS React component things, as we do, is it's really useful to export the raw, unconnected component from your file, as well as the raw map state to props function from your file. This is so that if you're to write tests for this particular component, you can write tests against the raw unconnected component and the logic for the map state to props separately. This makes it much easier to write your tests because otherwise, if you wanted to write your test with the connected component, you would have to mock the provider, the store, Redux stuff within your tests, which is fine if you have some sort of test utility that kind of handles it for you, but we currently don't. And that requires you to do a lot of scaffolding in order for you to even render your tests. And that's a pain in the butt. So By exporting these as separate pieces, you're able to cover the same amount of logic with less hassle. So something to think about. Um, so what do we need from the state? We need loading, and I believe that's all we need from the state. So let's check out the form. We have get is loading from the reducer. Okay. So from our map state to props, return is loading, and that is get is loading from the state. Cool. Did I do something wrong? Of course I did. There we go. Oh man, inline validation stuff, or was it static checking? Great stuff. Something I miss a lot when I use something like Vim, where I'm basically a cave person because I don't have syntax highlighting or any of that kind of stuff. Export const dispatch, no, sorry, map dispatch to props. So I need my save mechanism. Great. So connect with that. And now let's render my button. I need to pluck out is loading, and I also need to pluck out save from props. I'm gonna now copy this logic, paste it inside of here. Not logic, sorry, my component stuff. Save is that, great. Disabled is loading, great. Save changes, spinner, all this stays the same. I just abstracted it and moved it to this guy. So all we need to do now is within here, import save button from .save button. And I can just replace this guy now with this regular old button with a save button. It works just like normal. Great. So this cleans up this actions area a lot. And because I've abstracted is loading and save to the dedicated save button, I can now remove this bit from here. And just like that, our form view has become much simpler. It doesn't care about loading or any of that kind of stuff. That's the responsibility of the button. That's isolated to the save button. And here, this is nice because now I understand how the button works. It's responsible for loading and it's responsible for saving my form. And all of this is connected straight to Redux state. So there are some interesting things that you can do with this. Interesting refactors or interesting ways that you can think about stuff. So first off is I'm using isLoading in two different places, like so. One for disabled and one to actually render the spinner. IsLoading rendering the spinner makes sense to me because that's typically how it works. But for disabled, it's a little bit of a stretch. So this is something that you can do. I am going to cache isLoading as a variable inside of map state to props. IsLoadIn, yeah. Pass that in as normal. And I'm going to do disabled isLoading. Basically aliasing the value of isLoading to disabled, basically like what we're doing here. However, now we can do this. And just like that, this becomes a lot more simpler. So remapping things, as this function implies, to something that your bare bones component can understand is a very powerful technique. I use it a ton. And another really good example is instead of save, you can do this if you want to, depending on how you feel about things. You can also do this. Instead of save, we can do onClick. What is onClick? OnClick is save. So we just replace save with onClick. And now our component function is exactly the same. And this has gotten a lot more generic or simpler. So with that, I mean, because you're exporting the save button, you can then reuse this logic somewhere else or do any of that kind of stuff. You have a lot of freedom to move things around, which is nice. Yeah, so that's our save button. This is working as we expect. Great. Let's do a little bit more refactoring. So we have our title field here. I'm just going to create another file, title field. That's just all I'm gonna call it that. You can call it anything you want, really. Title input, title, whatever. And I basically want to pluck out this guy. So here is where I have to make my decision of where to make my cut. This is where you get to pretend to be a surgeon. I can make my cut just on the input itself, but then this label is still here. It's a responsibility of my form view to render the label, to render my title field. Doesn't feel that good. So I can make my cut here, where I encapsulate both the form label and the input. Or I can make my cut here, the entire form group itself. And form group is basically a presentational thing that gives extra margin to each field. So depending on how you plan on using your title field, whether you might use it somewhere else, or how you like to think about your components, you might either do this one or this one of the two. I wouldn't recommend just doing this one because you're leaving a little bit of something behind. You want to kind of bring the whole idea of what a title field is into a singular entity. And that's the point of creating these little components. So for my example, I'm going to take the entire form group and put that into title field. So I got to do the exact same thing here. I'm going to copy paste because that is much faster. Yay. What do I need? I need input from HSDS React. I don't need the spinner anymore. I need get title from the reducer, and I need update title from the actions. Here, I need the get title. And this gives you the raw title of the input field. But similar to what we did with the save button, I can remap it to something else. I'm going to remap this to value because that is what the input field expects. And we need the update title here. Whoopsies. So instead of doing onClick, or instead of having something called update title, I'm going to change this to onChange because that is what our input field expects. So all we need to do now is onChange in the value. Copy this, paste it into here. Label, we'll keep that. The value is a value. The onChange is the onChange. Rename save button because it's no longer a save button. Title field. Come on. It's telling me I'm doing something wrong, not defined. Oh, right, because I need this form group. Oh, right, I need this form label. Okay, everyone's happy? Great. Except this. What's wrong with this? Any. What am I doing wrong? Oh, typo, that's why. Great. Okay, so that is done. And similar to what we did in the button, we now can pull in title field directly, like that, and replace this guy with title field, and it should work like normal. We made our abstraction, we made our cut. And with that, we can now get rid of this because it's no longer being used. Get rid of this, no longer being used. Pluck. Pluck. Cool. So we have our exact same functionality. And again, form has gotten a lot more simpler. This dedicated title field component is just dedicated to updating the field and controlling it. Excuse me. And if you're to look at this, this is very similar. I mean, this is the container pattern that is used very heavily inside of Redux. And typically in the past, people would do something like this, where you would have your project, you'd have something called containers, and you have something called components. And then you plop all of your containers here, you plop all of your components here. Your component is basically this part, and your container is basically the thing that connects it to Redux. Um, and I think certain folks within Redux core team and also React have said, yeah, this particular pattern that's become very popular was probably not a good idea because you're making unnecessary abstractions between the two. You're further, like, you're adding additional separation of what that singular idea is by splitting the responsibility between these two things. You can very easily, like I've showed here, group them into, whoopsies, you can very easily group them into a single file. It doesn't take up much room. The complexity of this stuff lives not here, but here, the UI component. The UI component responsible for rendering this stuff, for knowing how to handle error states, for knowing how to do things when things change and like render focus and all of that kind of stuff. A lot of that complexity lives there. What you're doing here inside of your application component is binding your Redux state to that particular UI component via this. Essentially, this works as a container for your component to the UI component, and this file works as your container for your Redux state to your title field component, if that makes sense. And that's where that's where the cuts are. That's where the abstractions are. Cool. So now we have our title field component. I am going to create a new file called message field. I'm going to rename title field to message field. Message. So instead of get title, it's get message. Instead of update title, it's update message. And oh yeah, multi-line 7. Cool. And in my form, I just need to do this. Message field. I just need to do this now. Form group. Get rid of this. Cool. So my button, my message field, and my title field have now been abstracted into subcomponents that are dedicated to updating either the message, the title, and also the saving mechanism. All of that complexity and all of that logic is now abstracted from my form. I'm not using any of this anymore. So I can delete all this. I can delete these guys. I'm not mapping dispatch to props. I'm not mapping state to props. I can delete these. And since I'm not doing anything here, I don't even need Redux anymore. I don't even have props. So now all of this form component or form view does is that it binds the tiny little bits of components, the title field, the message field, and the save button. It composes them together. And that's what a view should do. It shouldn't really have a lot of logic going on. That should be abstracted into little components. All this guy does is that it brings them all together like a happy little family and renders it into the browser and go like, here, with this combination of components, this is what this particular URL or page should look like. And the functionality of rendering things, updating things, or whatever is isolated in those little guys, whether it's this title field, the message field, or the save button. And this is a really, really good way of thinking about your views, your components, your application, where the logic lives and how, and you can see this scales really, really well over time. You can just create lots of little components. It's fine. It's fine to create files. That's not where the complexity and the oh my God, this is so terrible lies. The oh my goodness part comes from trying to work with a gigantic 500 to 1,000 line file that has lots and lots of moving parts that are all globbed together into one. This is spaghetti code. And working with spaghetti is not fun. Eating it is, working with it is not. Unless you're gluten-free and all that kind of stuff. Anyway, so this raises a very interesting question. Does that mean that for every single field I'm adding to this form, I need to create a subcomponent for it? This one, I have to say, is entirely up to you and your application and how that's implemented. Because, and I say this with a big asterisk, because forms are, they are a completely their own kind of beast in terms of how they need to work. Because there's almost always form state that has to work in conjunction with Redux state, and there's and things that can update state. There's so many of them. There's so many fields, and then all you have to think about, the variability of all those guys, especially if things need to happen asynchronously, like things autosave, then put to the server and things like that. There's so many variables to it. So a good example of a library that tries to tame all this kind of stuff is Formic. It's very popular. We currently don't use Formic or any kind of form management kind of thing within React. We just kind of use Redux out of the box. So what Formic does is, do they have an example? Right. So you'd have to pluck out the Formic component, like so. And this works as basically a mini Redux. There's context to it, and it manages some state internally, and it does a bunch of stuff. But it has a render property that provides you with whatever the heck is going on in terms of your values, the validation and stuff, and it's up to you, the user, to render that stuff out. So in this case, it would be difficult to split the inputs into separate components because how this guy renders, you got to do it within this kind of Formic guy. So this simplifies a lot in terms of validation and like dirty checking and purity checking and all that kind of stuff, which is quite difficult to do in forms. So it's great that they've kind of taken that on for us. But it makes it constricting, I think, to handle and render the UI bit. So that's why I said with forms, it's really up to you in terms of how you plan on architecting your form view or your form component. In our example, we're not using any of that kind of stuff. We're just using straight connecting to Redux. So with that, there's freedom to it. There's more flexibility, more wiggle room. And with that in mind, it's fine to create lots of little subcomponents for every single field. So yeah, hopefully this was helpful. A tiny look into how you should think about your React, your Redux, your views, your components, your UI, where the logic should live, how you should connect things, and hopefully making you feel okay to create lots of little files and lots of little components because, like I mentioned before, the amount of logic doesn't change. It's like matter. You have it. It's just it's up to you to choose where you want to put it. Do you want a duck-sized horse, or you want 100 horse-sized ducks? What is it? You want one giant file, or you want 100 tiny files? Up to you. So hopefully you found this helpful. Thank you so much for tuning in, and I'll catch you later. Bye.